Hello. So, from April 2021 to April 2023, I was working on a startup within the wildfire space with one of my good friends, Valkyrie Homes. We started off as Project Firefly, which was a deep tech company focused on wildfire containment with vortex cannons attached to drones. About a year into that, we unfortunately had to pivot completely away from it, which was an unfortunate setback. But we had learned a lot about wildfires during the time that we spent on Project Firefly, and we both felt that though wildfire suppression and containment is really important, a lot of the time it really is just a matter of elbow grease from firefighters, and there isn't as much room to improve suppression techniques as we had originally thought. Where we had identified a larger issue was in wildfire prevention. Only a fraction of the budget and resources put towards wildfire fighting every year goes towards prevention efforts. But when done correctly, wildfire prevention efforts can save billions of dollars, protect thousands of structures, conserve wildlife, and even save human lives. So we wanted to develop a solution that helped make fire prevention easier, and we ended up finding a really great business opportunity for residential land. Homeowners living in areas with high wildfire risk often have very little knowledge of how to protect their property or prevent their homes from being burnt down. There are also significant financial barriers, and though there are grants available to help subsidize the cost, homeowners often have difficulty accessing these opportunities. Last February, Valkyrie and I partnered up with Napa Valley to experiment on our idea to accelerate wildfire prevention activities in communities with high wildfire risk through collaborating with HOAs. And they were extremely kind to take us on a tour through Napa Valley, Calistoga, and Berryessa Lake, areas infamously known for being particularly affected by the 2020 California wildfires, to show us the state of both private and public forest lands and what measures were being taken to prepare the region for the 2023 wildfire season. Though I stepped away from this project in April to focus on my startup Vunatech, Valkyrie and Amanda Southworth are still working hard to bring our idea to life and are doing an amazing job of it. Definitely visit their website to learn more about their work and subscribe to their newsletter if you're interested in how it progresses. Anyway, despite having stepped away, I still think this is a huge issue that needs solving, and I wanted to share the learnings that Valkyrie and I got from our field visit in Napa County back in February, since they're just so eye-opening, and it's scary how little most people know about wildfire prevention, even if they live in high-risk regions. So before I dive into the specifics of our trip to Napa Valley and what we learned, I do want to give some background knowledge on the basics of wildfire behavior and wildfire prevention, as it will be helpful to understand the footage from Napa Valley, and also is just really good general knowledge to have, especially if you live in an area with any type of wildfire risk. So firstly, you should know that wildfire has a tendency to spread uphill. Often, in order to contain a wildfire, firefighters will build fuel breaks on mountain or hill ridges so that if a fire reaches the top from any angle, it will be prevented from moving back down the other side of the hill. A fuel break is exactly what it sounds like, a break in fuel. These are strips of land from which all possible fuel, like long grass, trees, or shrub, are removed so that wildfire has nothing to burn and can't spread past the break. Fuel breaks can also be roads or highways that separate the forest landscape, or they can be a body of water like a river or creek. Anything that provides a gap in available fuel for a fire to burn is a fuel break. In the past, wildfires used to create natural fuel breaks by burning all the fuel in spaced out, localized patches. Wildfire has always been a natural, healthy, and necessary occurrence in forests for this reason. They prevent forests from getting too dense and periodically get rid of dead or dying vegetation by turning it into biochar, which helps replenish and nourish the soil for new plants to grow. However, for the past century, humans have played a large role in disrupting this process through over-aggressive wildfire fighting. Our approach to wildfires has for a long time been, if it's burning, put it out. However, by preventing so many wildfires for so many years, we have allowed our forests to become densely overgrown with dead and dry vegetation. Our idea of a forest is a lush, vibrant sea of green, when in reality, forests should show some evidence of wildfire. Here you can see two pictures of the same landscape, one taken in 1936 before excessive wildfire fighting took place, and one taken in 2012. At first glance, you might think the picture from 2012 is a healthier forest, but in reality, it's a breeding ground for a massive wildfire. If a wildfire started in the 1936 landscape, it would burn relatively locally, and controlling it would be feasible if it happened to threaten humans. If a wildfire were to start in the 2012 landscape, the abundant fuel would cause it to spread dangerously fast and far, and it would be much more difficult to control it if it came into the vicinity of homes or structures. In addition to the warmer and drier conditions created by climate change, this mismanagement of wildfire and consequent overgrowth of forests has led to a concerning increase in the number of megafire occurrences. Megafires, which are wildfires that burn 100,000 acres of land or more, used to be rare, but in the past 40 years, they've increased in frequency dramatically. In fact, the average number of acres consumed by wildfire in the United States has increased by 1,000%. Not only are we seeing a higher number of wildfires every year, but those wildfires are also burning more land and increasing in intensity. Worse, it's a positive feedback loop, as more intense and massive wildfires accelerate global warming and exacerbate the already hot and dry conditions that are responsible for increasing wildfire risk to begin with. While these statistics are quite overwhelming, the good news is that we have ways of addressing the issue. It starts with better forest management. By creating fuel breaks, burning controlled fires, and mechanically thinning forest vegetation, we can start to restore forests to their naturally patchy states and help keep wildfires more controlled and localized when they do start. This sounds simple enough in theory, but of course, it's quite difficult to do in practice. It requires a large amount of policy changes, funding, and skilled labor. States such as California are setting an example for the kinds of programs and policies necessary to this work, but the change is still slow moving. When Valkyrie and I were initially starting Ember Bazaar, which is now Faura, we wanted to start somewhere that didn't require extensive collaboration with the government for this exact reason. That's why we focused on residential property. It's starting small from a land and forest management perspective, but changes in thinking and action amongst small or localized groups of people eventually lead to larger change movements. Plus, there is a clear need for better products and resources to help people protect their properties from wildfire, and a very strong incentive for people to want to pay for such projects and resources. So we figured it made the most sense from a business standpoint, and that it was a good start for moving the needle towards better forest and land management in general. The more people we can help and educate on this matter, the easier it will be to enact large-scale change. So what exactly does wildfire prevention look like on residential land? There's actually a lot more to it than you might think, and I could make a whole other video just going into the details of what is involved and what a homeowner should be doing to protect their property. However, I do want to just give a quick run through right now because it is extremely important for people to be aware of it and will help with understanding some of the footage from the Napa County visit. So essentially there are two main things that homeowners need to be doing in order to protect their home if they live in an area with wildfire risk: defensible space and home hardening. Creating defensible space means clearing the vegetation and fuel on and around a home, and home hardening refers to optimizing the actual mechanics and materials used to build and design the home itself to minimize wildfire risk. Defensible space should be created up to at least 30 feet away from a home around all sides, but ideally up to 100 feet away. Creating defensible space can involve removing trees or shrubs from the property, clearing away dead leaves, twigs, or other debris from the ground, roof, and decks, or trimming beneath plants to keep flammable material away from the ground. It may also involve strategically spacing out trees and plants so that fire cannot easily spread between them, or replacing flammable plants with more fire-resistant species. Home hardening activities, on the other hand, might involve installing visible signage near the property to help firefighters find it in case of wildfire, ensuring the roof is made of a fire-resistant material like tile or asphalt, or covering chimney or stovepipe openings with metal mesh screens to prevent embers from entering and setting the house on fire. Side note, with high winds, embers can travel as far as 5 miles away from the wildfire itself and can set fire to structures within this vicinity. Many homes have been burnt down due to embers landing in open vents, underneath wooden decks, or inside uncovered chimneys, even though the wildfire itself never actually reached the property. Home hardening also involves installing double or triple paned windows, for example, or building a deck out of concrete or composite material and ensuring it is covered underneath instead of being open. Now, this is just a brief overview of wildfire prevention for residential property, but if you are interested or if this is applicable to you, I highly encourage you to visit napafirewise.org/dspace to learn more about it. Napa Firewise, who Valkyrie and I collaborated with for our pilot project, has a ton of amazing resources, as well as a grant program for people who need monetary assistance to complete defensible space work on their property. Even if you don't live in Napa County, I would recommend filling out the application for this grant, as it does a great job of walking through everything that should be done to create defensible space and harden a home against wildfire in a detailed but easy to understand way. So now that I've given you some background on wildfire behavior and prevention tactics, here's the footage taken from Valkyrie and my trip to Napa Valley this past February. So our tour spanned over 2 days, February 20th and February 21st, and it began in Napa Valley, a region famous both for its wineries and its wildfires. The most destructive wildfire the valley has ever seen, known as the Glass Fire, took place relatively recently, beginning in late September of 2020 and lasting 23 days. In that time, it burnt over 67,000 acres of land and destroyed more than 1,500 structures, which included 642 homes and 343 commercial buildings. The photos that emerged of that wildfire depicting the hellish landscapes of Napa Valley and the surrounding regions became infamous around the world. Over 2 years later, the aftermath of that fire can still be seen from the valley. However, many residents have been working hard to prevent future wildfires. Paul Heiseman, a board member of Napa Firewise and a resident of Napa Valley himself, is one of the people spearheading these initiatives. He took us through the valley and pointed out where homeowners are doing fuel management and home hardening work and where there's still room for improvement. So for example, he showed us a creek that was divided between two properties, and on one side of the creek, the homeowner had done a really great job of clearing out all the shrub and overgrowth to prevent risk of fire, whereas the homeowner on the other side of the creek had not done any work, and there was lots of dead and dry shrub growing around the creek that presented a very high risk of wildfire. He also showed us a little chasm with a bunch of very overgrown shrub that needed to be cleared, because if a fire somehow made it to the bottom of that area, it would spread upwards in all directions extremely rapidly and quickly get out of control, so it presented a very serious wildfire risk. Another property was in the process of completing vegetation management, so we could clearly see the differences between the land he had treated and the land he was still working on, which was amazing to see. After a quick visit to Tres Sabors, a beautiful winery in the valley with sheep and beautiful scenery, and a very cute dog, we drove all the way up to the top of the valley to get a more bird's eye view of it all. From there, you could still see the aftermath of the Glass Fire on the adjacent ridge tops. Some of the valley looked pretty patchy and well managed, whereas other parts looked extremely overgrown. We could also see some of the areas through which power lines ran through and how some of the shrub had been cleared away from them, as they can sometimes start wildfires if they get too close to any type of fuel. Paul also took us to his own property to demonstrate the defensible space and home hardening work that he had been doing. For example, they had completely cleared the ground vegetation around their home and cut down some trees in order to ensure they were better spaced out. He explained how he wanted to continue clearing it out all the way down to the bottom of the hill to prevent a wildfire from burning uphill and getting to his property. He also showed us how he had installed a water tank for firefighters to use if needed, and had done things like close off the underneath part of his deck with a metal gate, installed metal mesh on all of his vents and chimneys, and cleared out the vegetation around his propane tank to prevent fire from coming near to it. After all that, we headed to Gott's for a lovely lunch. So we just finished a nice tour of Napa Valley with Paul, and now we're gonna have lunch with him and Emily, and it's been really, really, really cool.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in heaven. I love the area so much, and I just feel like seeing it is really helpful to try and figure. I think I'm answering a lot of my own questions about the kinds of people that live here and the kinds of
barriers.
Yeah, exactly. And so
what it actually takes to do this kind of work.
Yeah,
it's kind of a lot.
Yeah. But yeah.
So this is the lovely Paul who's been taking us on our tour.
Hello everybody. I'm having the great privilege of escorting these two bright young smart people through Napa Valley so they can see what we're doing to make it a safer community. It's a beautiful day and lots of smart brains thinking about our problem here, and lots of good solutions coming our way.
Yeah. After lunch, Valkyrie and I went to meet Piper Cole, who is another board member of Napa Firewise, and she took us to see one of her neighbor's houses who was doing his own vegetation removal work on his property. He had a huge property with a ton of really dry and overgrown vegetation, And again, we could see the huge contrast between the land he'd already treated and the land he hadn't got to yet. And it really made us appreciate the sheer amount of work that goes into creating defensible space. Across the road, we also saw a prescribed fire burning, which was probably just a pile of dead vegetation, as people usually deal with the vegetation they remove by burning it. Another way of dealing with it is by chipping it all into tiny little pieces and then using that as fertilizer. And in California, there's a really great chipping program which goes around to a bunch of properties with a chipping machine and chips people's debris and vegetation for free as an incentive to remove it from their property. Piper also drove us up into the site of the 2020 lightning complex fires, where we could still see the aftermath with tons of blackened trees. Concerningly, the vegetation in these areas were still extremely dense, which does not bode well for future wildfire seasons. She also showed us around her own property in Calistoga and her wide open backyard in contrast to her neighbor's backyard just across the road with the extremely dense and dry vegetation was again very eye-opening. The next day, we began by meeting with Mike Wilson, who worked as a firefighter for Cal Fire for over 20 years and actually helped start Napa Firewise and the county chipping program that I mentioned back in 2004. He showed us around a community called Silverado, which is a relatively affluent community in Napa County, which was particularly impacted by the Atlas Peak wildfire in 2017. He showed us a large fuel break project that had been undertaken in the region to help contain and prevent future wildfires, in which goats had been used to clear much of the vegetation along a ravine. Here you can see the fuel break that was created, which will be a huge help in slowing any future wildfires from crossing this ravine and give firefighters the extra time they need to mobilize their resources to effectively stop the fire and protect people's homes and lives. Had that fuel break not existed, a wildfire could easily and very quickly move up the ravine in all directions, and firefighters would lose control of it. Maintenance is only required for this fuel break once a year, and a couple hundred goats can clear it all in a matter of hours. After that, we visited a creek next to the nicest golf course in Silverado, which had undergone extensive vegetation removal. This is the aftermath of the treatment, but before it had been extremely overgrown with dead and dry shrub and presented a concerning wildfire risk to the surrounding community. Though it was difficult to get the vegetation removal approved due to the proximity of the creek and concerns about disrupting the creek ecosystem, it was definitely worth all the effort, as the creek now acts as a natural fuel break as opposed to a wildfire breeding ground. After visiting the creek, Valkyrie and I ended the tour with Stephanie Lunsford, who is in charge of wildfire prevention initiatives at Cal Fire. She drove us up to Lake Berryessa, which was another site severely impacted by the 2020 lightning complex wildfire. Over 250 residents lost their home in this area, and 3 people lost their lives. Driving through this area, we could see all of the blackened trees in some of the sites where homes had burnt down and people were rebuilding. We stopped and climbed up to a ridge point to see another fuel break that had been created along a ridgeline of one of the mountains, and for some reason I didn't actually take a clear shot of the ridgeline, but in this clip, I'm standing right on it, and from that vantage point, we also had a very clear view of Berryessa Lake, which was beautiful. Again, the reason they create fuel breaks along ridgelines is because the fire has a lot harder of a time spreading downhill, so by catching the fire at the top of the ridgelines, it is much easier to prevent them from continuing down the other side, as opposed to trying to prevent them from continuing uphill. So right now, we're at Berryessa Lake with Stephanie, who works for Cal Fire. She's awesome. And we're going to be
ridge lines,
taking a look at the ridge line up here.
Vegetation management, and a bunch of other things. Going through some burnt forest right now. And
yeah, very high wildfire risk in these parts. And that wraps up the footage from the tour. Hopefully you found that informative and demonstrative of the kind of work that goes into wildfire prevention, both on residential and public forest land. Valkyrie and I learned a lot from being able to see the work that Napa County has been doing, and we both really believe that they are a really great model for what communities around the world should be doing to protect themselves against wildfire. Overall, we need now more than ever to be investing in wildfire prevention efforts and acting proactively instead of reactively. And we need to shift our relationship with wildfire and see it as a natural aspect of healthy forests instead of something to be feared and extinguished at all costs. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who took the time to show us around the county and answer all of our questions, including Paul, Piper, Emily, Mike, and Stephanie. And an extra big thank you to Paul for organizing everything. I also want to give one last plug to Faura. Please check them out. Their website is faura.us, that's faura.us, and they're doing amazing work to help accelerate wildfire prevention in residential areas, and they're also currently raising a seed round. Bye for now.